Welcome to Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week, my co-host Rebecca Sugar and I will try to make sense out of the nonsense and bring a little bit of sanity to your week. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Ari. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Ari's just back from an adventure in the Middle East.
It's true, and we'll get to some of that. That's obviously still unfolding story.
I can't wait to hear all about it. I wanted to just first do the quote of the day.
Please.
It's from the Babylon Bee. Posted on X yesterday, the following headline: Ayatollah proudly announces Iran has destroyed 14 bunker buster bombs with its nuclear facilities. It was unclear to me if this actually was the Babylon Bee's creation or if they pulled this quote from, I don't know, CNN's Jen Psaki or Caitlin Collins. It's hard to tell, actually. Right. But
well,
of course,
the first
the Babylon
thing to
Bee
say
is a satirical publication, I should say that. But sometimes you can't tell the difference.
And the national treasure, I'd say, the Babylon Bee.
Yeah.
Great. I mean, that's sort of where we're starting in the bunker busting, and just to give everyone a little rundown of our program today. The top story will be Iran, the fallout, not nuclear, thankfully, but political and otherwise. We're going to go to Make It Make Sense section. We're going to cover some breaking news here on Friday, and that is the Supreme Court's ruling on the nationwide injunction issue. This could be one of the more important rulings, not only in and of itself, but in terms of setting the course of the rest of President Trump's term. And then our tipping point is, don't worry, we haven't forgotten about the Zohran phenomenon, and we're going to do a deep dive into New York City politics, which is had an earthquake this week, I think, a bunker busting earthquake in terms of our political scene. So. Rebecca, let's start with Iran. Obviously, I was there for the war, not intentionally, but like a lot of other folks, got stuck there and reported on it and wrote about it, and we're now in the peace, I guess you'd say. We have a ceasefire. For me, some of the more exciting news to be coming out lately is we're hearing some reports, both in the press and from the administration, about a possible expansion of the Abraham Accords, right? And Syria is being thrown in there, maybe some kind of deal to end the war in Gaza, the possibility of Bibi going to the White House. It seems like things are moving fast. And I think for a lot of us, it shows that kind of decisive, military victory, a show of strength, is crucial to winning the peace that comes after. But what are some of your thoughts?
When you were on the ground, Ari, did you have the sense that, you're in the middle of a war, there were bombs falling, you were in bomb shelters all the time, you probably got almost no sleep at all. What sense did you have of the kinds of implications of a successful attack on Iran by the Israelis and the U.S. Would result? Do you think other people thought that Saudi Arabia could be signing the Abraham Accords shortly, and all the things you just mentioned could be happening?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Rebecca, and I'll sort of take it in stages. I mean, one is, I was in Tel Aviv. The reputation is as a hyper-liberal city. It's a city where a lot of the kind of public demonstration for the hostages have been held, and you see that. And just looking around at some of the graffiti, some of the signage, very critical of Bibi, very critical of the Gaza war. But then this war was launched, and I didn't see any of that. I saw a real kind of united front, and it was almost kind of, this was seen as a war of necessity, even though in a way it was more preemptive right, than the Gaza war. But this was seen as sort of a just war. And I think lots of reasons for that. But I think mostly because I think Israelis understand that there's no dealing with these proxies ultimately without dealing with Iran. And this has been in the Israeli consciousness for a long time that Iran is kind of the ultimate enemy, right? So I think there was a lot of unity of purpose around that. I think there was this realization that the nature of Iran's missiles, these ballistic missiles, were different in kind than the kind of rockets that the Houthis and Hamas launch. I mean, these are rockets that could take down buildings. So there was a real sense of of seriousness, and that this is an enemy worth fighting. And you saw support for Bibi from across the political spectrum. Even
how much of the actual impact of those missiles in Israel did you personally see? What did it look like on the ground?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think there was a couple of senses involved. One is the ear, and you heard booms. Now, some of those booms were impact. A lot of them were intercepts, right, in the sky. You also felt it. I mean, you felt things shaking. Now, not from a direct hit, thank God. People were killed from direct hits, but even from shrapnel and nearby hits. And, and then the sight is, sometimes, I would walk out where I was staying and it was bombed out. I mean, it was really, a really cool area right around Allenby Street was all splinter and jagged concrete and twisted metal. I had gotten a bite to eat on Saturday night. By Monday, it was just a pile of rubble, that same restaurant. So, it was very close. And it also affected the whole country. I mean, you had direct hits in Haifa, which is to the north, and Beersheba, which is all the way to the south. So just to say that, this was all really an all-of-society effort, I think a second stage of this was the American involvement, as you mentioned. And there, Israelis were very supportive and grateful, I think. When I was sort of leaving, going through Amman, on the Israeli side of the border, multiple people, Israeli border security forces, said to me, God bless America and thank you, and things like that. So there's a real sense of gratitude towards that involvement.
I'd like to ask you just one other question about the missiles hitting. Iron Dome is, of course, the great Israeli shield against these kinds of attacks. And I think by all accounts, it worked quite well, but it's not perfect. It can't be. And at some stage, I was reading that, up to 30% of the missiles being launched by Iran were making it through the Iron Dome shield. So how did it feel on the ground? How do Israelis see that protection system, that defense system today?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it was a very dynamic situation, right? Because Iran is launching missiles, and at the same time, Israel is not only in a defensive crouch, but also was offensively trying to take out those missiles before they even arrived, and to eliminate the rocket launchers, but also the personnel. So, over time, there was a matter of days in which Iran's ability to do that was degraded. But as you said, plenty of missiles still got through. It's the classic situation where every death is just unbelievably sad and certainly felt close to home. But on the other hand, if you had said ahead of time, there will be a full-scale war with Iran and Israel will lose some 30 civilians, people wouldn't believe that. I mean, it borders on the miraculous. Some war scenarios I saw reported were, contemplating thousands of deaths easily. Through missiles raining down on Israeli cities. So I think the reasons for that were the Iron Dome, not only the Iron Dome though, but also the early warning system, the foresight to build bomb shelters. I mean, there's really a kind of script and protocol to keep people safe. And secondly was the astonishing success of Israel's attack that first night. right, which really kind of put Iran on the back foot. I love that it's just come out that the effort to assassinate Iran's military high command was called Operation Red Wedding. I don't know if you're a Game of Thrones fans, but it certainly felt that that kind of wipeout initially, put Israel in a strong position going forward. Yeah.
Also, Ari, while all eyes were on this war with Iran, there was an ongoing war battle happening with Gaza still, and was not paid much attention to for obvious reasons. And as you pointed out, the discussions now between America and Israel and other Middle Eastern countries has to do with expelling Hamas leadership from the Gaza Strip, maybe the UAE and Egypt taking over, ruling that part of the world. There's conversation about a two-state solution with parts of the West Bank becoming that second state. So it feels like a lot is shifting on the Gaza front too. What were people talking about? All of that, and of course the hostages, not to leave that out, that they would be returned as part of this deal. What were people thinking and saying about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Israelis, far more than people here, have always understood the Palestinian issue to be a regional issue, right? It's sort of interconnected. And I think that's very much the case here, where the understanding is that the military success against Iran kind of opens up possibilities on that front. I think there are a couple of things to say here. One is, just as I was leaving, came word, or maybe once I was back, that 7 soldiers were killed when their vehicle was blown up. And so there's still a very human toll here. I mean, in a small country, that's an unbelievable tragedy to happen in one day. And, so it is a war zone, just to say. There is still, a sort of loss of life all around. The other, one other way of thinking about this is, does Bibi's success in Iran give him a little bit more political flexibility in terms of exploring options? Does he call snap elections? Do we have a different kind of coalition that comes in? So, there's a sort of maybe a set of possibilities here that are emerging. When he comes to America, are they planning some kind of big announcement, right? When he's here in DC, and I think there is an interest in figuring out what happens in Gaza. I think at a certain point, there are diminishing returns, both in terms of Israeli soldiers, public opinion, Israel's hemorrhaging support there. So, I think, I hope that they're exploring ways to sort of kind of like build on the success of the Iran operation in the diplomatic front. I mean, you could say that whatever you think about Bibi, his effort to convince America to join that fight is one of Israel's signal diplomatic achievements since the creation of the state. I mean, it's an astonishing notion to convince a president that had strong isolationist leanings in his cabinet to involve in that key moment and deliver what we think is that key blow to Iran.
Yes, and that leads me to sort of my take on what was happening here and people's perspective here on this, on the U.S. participation in the war. I personally was, I'm happy to see Iran's nuclear program thwarted. I'm happy to see realignment in the Middle East. All the things that I think there are potentials for, I think are just good, net. But there was a lot of worry and concern about the U.S. Entering the war, whatever that meant, whether it was just a strike or sort of getting us involved in something broader. And there was a quick, response by those who favored U.S. action to attack those who were raising questions. And I just want to say, as somebody who supported the U.S. strike on the Iranian nuclear sites, that I think it's appropriate for Americans to ask the question, is this good for us? Is this in the United States' interests and not just in the interests of others? I don't think it was wrong to ask those questions. I think it's healthy, and I think we shouldn't attack people who do it. Some didn't do it in good faith, fair enough, but plenty of people did. And the response was isolationist or fringe, right-wing isolationist or even anti-Semite. And again, in certain cases, those labels land, but in many cases they don't. And I think we make a mistake when we shut down the conversation like that, even if we support the action. So I just wanted to maybe call attention to that, and also to say that, the very people who were the most opposed to the U.S. striking were also inclined to sort of blame Israel for everything and to say that Israel is pulling, America's strings and they're in control of everything. They fail to mention that there were other countries in the region who stood to benefit, perhaps even more than Israel, from defanging Iran, namely Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which were more easily reachable by Iranian nukes than Israel if they had come to the point of creating them. So they were in even more imminent danger. So this sort of false narrative that it was Israel alone driving this and the U.S. was just following its masters, it's not just anti-Semitic, but it's just wrong.
Yeah. And I think, in a way, I think that's well said, Rebecca, that, obviously the specter of Iraq and Afghanistan hangs over stuff. But, if you could design a sort of strike, at least so far, what we think is limited, effective, and in line with how the president sees the world, right? I think this would have been it. And that largely a function of Israel's success before in setting the stage for this possibility. And, if you say, well, okay, what happened? You had the strike and then you had a ceasefire, right? So for the White House perspective, I think that's a pretty good outcome, and just shows that, sometimes smart escalation can actually be the key to de-escalation, right? That sort of using power intelligently and in a focused way can be a net positive. Okay, let's jump. We could talk about the Iran Israel situation all day, but let's jump back to these shores, and that's the decision that just came down. Right, this is the end of the Supreme Court's term, so this is sort of like bottom of the ninth inning. And this was really the big case from this term in a lot of ways, the case people were looking at. Just to kind of catch everyone up, this is a case about birthright citizenship, but sort of confusingly, it's actually not about birthright citizenship. The justices said we don't want to really deal with that big question, whether President Trump can outlaw birthright citizenship. The 14th Amendment would seem to suggest that it's allowed. Trump's executive order on day one said, I want to get rid of it. Fine. But the Supreme Court didn't hear that issue. They said, can a single judge make a ruling that affects the whole country? That was sort of the issue they wanted to decide. Now, you might say, well, I guess so, but it's a kind of new thing, actually, relatively, nationwide injunctions, very legally untested, and exactly the kind of question the Supreme Court likes to weigh in on. And by 6-3 margin, opinion written by Justice Barrett, they said basically no, that judges can decide the case before them. Right? If you and I were in a courtroom, Rebecca, that the judge could decide our dispute, but that judgment wouldn't automatically apply everywhere, from California to New York, coast to coast.
They left some wiggle room, right? That it might in certain cases, but generally
right.
It would not.
Right.
Let me just ask you a quick question, though, on the birthright citizenship piece of this. So as it stands now, does President Trump's EO on birthright citizenship stand, or is it going to go to appeal in seven courts and then back to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so it doesn't stand in the courtrooms where it's been rejected, right? But it does stand where it hasn't yet been heard, let's say, or it hasn't yet been challenged, right?
So in certain states today, an illegal immigrant can give birth to a child, and that child would not be considered an American citizen because of that EO. But in other states where that EO has already been challenged, that child would be considered an American citizen.
Right, because that EO has been frozen. Enjoined is the legal word, but it's important to add that the Supreme Court said this doesn't take effect for 30 days, right? So that injunction is in place. And the idea there, I think, is the court wanted to give people the opportunity to pursue other means of challenging this EO, most notably class action lawsuits, right? People might know class action suits from kind of personal injury, right? We all lived in this apartment and we all got asbestos, so we're going to sue, the apartment for $1 billion. Class action is kind of a way to get around this nationwide injunction, right? Because it applies to lots of people, but that's because those people are all technically defendants, right? They're all technically like one party to the case. So just to say, there's still a lot of litigation to go here, but at the moment, it's going to be much harder for a single judge to say, okay, this holds for the whole country. Now, it's important to note, Rebecca, this is, nationwide injunctions have pissed off Democrats as well as Republicans, right? I mean, this also, it goes both ways. I mean, there's, conservative judges in Texas who have issued rulings, let's say, about abortion pills that have infuriated Democrats because they applied nationwide. So this has been a kind of, boogeyman for both sides. And the judges said, the court said, this kind of has to stop in this form.
So which specific cases that we're moving through the courts right now will this ruling directly affect in terms of nationwide injunctions that favor President Trump? What's going to happen now that he was trying to see happen? I think a lot of us have lost track of all the various cases.
Yeah, and there are a lot of them. I mean, some statistics show that more of these injunctions were issued in the first couple months of Trump's presidency than were issued in the entirety of Biden's presidency over 4 years, right? So there's definitely a lot. I think a lot of those will try to be, relitigated, right? So it's you'll see a lot more lawsuits brought, in different courts, but it becomes.
Well, that's an important point then to raise for the non-legal among us. What does that mean? The Supreme Court just ruled that you cannot issue national injunctions by district courts unless there's sort of very specific circumstances that would warrant them. So wouldn't that just stop everybody, all these judges and district courts, from issuing the injunctions? You seem to be suggesting that they're still going to try.
No, I don't think they'll try, but I think what you'll have is many more challenges, right? Because let's say I live in Maine and I want to stop the executive order. I can no longer count on being protected by the court in New York, right? So you'll see kind of like many more plaintiffs saying, hey, I want to be protected. I want to be protected. I want to be protected. The logic of nationwide injunctions was that some issues are just more easily disposed of, like on a national scale, right? Especially with immigration.
More statewide challenges.
Exactly.
But we won't be, seeing this happen in a nationwide basis. And can we also expect then in the next 30 days a mass effort to put together a class action lawsuit on the birthright citizenship issue and for that to come back to the Supreme Court?
Yeah. I mean, I think the question here now is, okay, we've dealt with this process question around nationwide injunctions. How does it get back to the court on the merits, right? And how that will take longer without a nationwide injunction, right? Because you're going to have more kind of small local suits and not going to have like, okay, this one big thing that we're going to challenge and appeal to the Supreme Court. And that was part of the argument against this ban on nationwide injunctions is, you're going to have it be kind of really piecemeal. And in fact, it could be, and this is a little bit, sort of like you have to put on your legal strategy hat, if the government loses one of these local cases, right, specific cases, I should say, it might not even bother to appeal it, right? Because if it only applies in a very limited way, maybe you just leave it be instead of appealing it and then losing higher up, right? Whereas on if it's a nationwide injunction, you have to appeal it because your whole policy depends on it. So we could see an unusual situation where the government loses a lot of these cases, just takes the L, right? And maybe wins some other ones and is kind of like, okay, this is better than nothing. If they think they have the weaker argument on the merits, they're going to try to prevent it from getting back to the Supreme Court.
Was the Supreme Court decision here effectively a vote for states' rights? Am I correct in saying that? Was this sort of saying this is about each state making their own rules?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Rebecca, and we're seeing that across the Supreme Court's decisions, or is this interest in federalism, let's call it, right? And this was true.
South Carolina Planned Parenthood decision.
Planned Parenthood, right? And we might see it with some of these religious liberty cases too. This notion of not wanting, and even as far back as Dobbs, right, and overturning Roe v. Wade, sort of not being uncomfortable with more nationwide solutions and saying, let's kind of return this to the states, to a more local. We had an editorial about the Planned Parenthood case saying, this is, Louis Brandeis's famous phrase, the states are the laboratory of democracy, right? And this is where these questions should be adjudicated.
Before we just move on to tipping point section, I just wanted to ask you wrote a really interesting piece earlier this week about the language that was being used in these opinions, and Justice Jackson sort of excoriating the majority opinion and really maybe crossing a line even in terms of how far she went in sort of attacking her fellow Supreme Court justices. So just say a word about that, because that's sort of fun, scandalous part of this story.
Yeah, absolutely. There was this sort of striking situation. I won't go too into the weeds with the case. It was a American with Disabilities case, and the Supreme Court basically held that the statute didn't protect this woman's claims. And, reason, fair enough, happens all the time. And but there was a dissent with Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson. Justice Kagan in this case was actually with the majority, and is sort of remarkably, Sotomayor joined the dissent except for one footnote. Well, you never see this, where you say, I agree with everything you said except that one thing. And, take a look at footnote 12, and it basically, is a broadside at the court is a misunderstanding the Constitution, is pursuing the ends it wants. And so just, striking kind of language. I think, in doing some calling around to some Supreme Court watchers, one thing is to say is that, Jackson, she's young relatively. She'll be on the court a long time. Doesn't really seem to have much interest in kind of being buddy-buddy, with the court's majority. Sotomayor is one of the older justices, and is, maybe adopting a little bit more of a kind of, sort of elder statesman vibe, but it was remarkable.
Is that considered just sort of bad justice behavior, or have you seen this before?
Yeah, I think when you it was here, and there was another case where she talked about the court being too kind to moneyed interests. I do think there are lines with dissent, and I think when you start attacking sort of motivation, or intent, that seems like it sort of breaches some notion of collegiality.
Sort of Justice Jackson feels like the Jasmine Crockett of the Supreme Court.
Jasmine with a law degree. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the tipping point. And I feel like it's like, I'm almost imagining like Manhattan tipping into the ocean. It's kind of like a boat tipping. And we've spoken a lot in this program, Rebecca, about this race. We broke down.
I feel like you called this, or the possibility of it, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe, but I think let's just take a step back and say, kind of remarkable. I mean, Cuomo came into the race, 100% name recognition, put up $25 million, was way up in the polls. But, I think we'll talk about kind of the real stakes of this, but just from a horse race perspective, he didn't earn it. He didn't earn it. He ran a terrible campaign. He was nowhere. I can't think of a single anything about him. I can't a single moment, a single. We've just to kind of maybe peel the curtain a little bit back. I mean, we tried to have him on this program to talk to people, and didn't really happen. And I just to say, I think there was a broader kind of rose garden basement strategy here, running out the clock, and it just didn't work.
Yeah, I think Zohran Mandani was famously making these fun, in air quotes, fun TikTok videos, walking up to halal food cart vendors and asking them about the price of chicken skewers, and Cuomo was spending other people's money on television ads that nobody saw, and talking about being a good manager, which could not be more uninspiring. Plus he carried the baggage with him of his COVID behavior, and certainly the Orthodox communities in Brooklyn, who would have normally run to the polls to vote for him over Mamdani. I don't think the exact numbers are out yet, but they didn't seem animated by it. And he was unwilling, Cuomo, to really do a mea culpa. Maybe he was worried about liability, but he missed that vote. He came with all the Me Too baggage. I don't know why the Democrats keep running the most unappealing, unlikable, sort of establishment characters that they can find, and expect that they'll get a better result. I mean, maybe that's literally the definition of insanity. So that fits our show perfectly. Yeah. You weren't here this week. I did the Sanity interview with political consultant and pollster John McLaughlin, and we had a long conversation about the data, the details. A lot of our conversation was about the messaging, the bad messaging of Cuomo, the effective messaging of Mamdani. But I think it's also, listen, Senator John Fetterman said it best when he said this is like Christmas in July for the GOP. If Mamdani is the mayor of New York City, nobody in New York City is a winner. But across the state and nationally, Republicans are going to use this, are already using this as a campaign, as campaign momentum. And they should. And people like Governor Kathy Hochul are going to have to either, join forces with an avowed socialist, and then risk her seat, and because people statewide don't like socialists, and others around the country are going to have to defend this or back away from it. And so there are a lot of problems for Democrats because of the Mamdani win. It seems like a huge win for Democrats. I think it's net not going to be a positive for them, and the Republicans are going to reap the benefits of this long term.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Anyone could see that Mamdani had momentum. The ads were great. The merch was great. I mean, I love just aesthetically, that kind of style. It was a really remarkable campaign. I was sort of, I missed a lot of it. I mean, I remember being out with some friends a couple months ago on the Lower East Side, and ran into a Mamdani true believer. And I said, I get it. I get it in Park Slope. I get it in Bushwick. I get it in Bed-Stuy. I get the hipsters. I just said, there's no way he can win enough, working class votes, enough black votes. I was wrong. I mean, he put together, it wasn't close. It really wasn't close. Like, you went over the numbers with John McLaughlin, but he put together this coalition. I understand Democrats' excitement. I mean, they haven't won in a while, and certainly he's a new face. But I just to step back a little bit, I think as a New Yorker, a Jewish New Yorker, it's distressing. I mean, there's without getting into the kind of is he an anti-Semite kind of discourse. I mean, just the facts. Started a Student for Justice in Palestine chapter, supports BDS, doesn't support Israel as a Jewish state.
Arrest Bibi Netanyahu.
Arrest Bibi Netanyahu is okay with globalize the Intifada. Now, a lot of folks say, well, this election isn't about Israel. Well, it's like, okay, well, that's true, but he said that Palestinian issues are the center of his identity, a center of his political identity. He just posted this morning, an article about Gaza on X. So it's he's the one kind of running on this. You can even say this is kind of his secret sauce in a lot of ways. I think this is what kind of excites people a lot. A certain segment of his demographic is he is the encampment candidate. Like he's the protest candidate. And the truth is, for Jews nowadays, anti-Semitism has come home, and these are local issues. The safety of Jews, anti-Semitism on the streets are intimately tied to the kinds of stances he's taken. And I have no confidence that he will at all sort of stand up for Jewish safety, and Jews will have to do it on their own. And the first thing they can do is figure out a way how to beat him in November.
Well, this is an important conversation to have, one I started to have with John McLaughlin, and one that I'm having with a lot of my friends who are up in arms and starting to organize around defeating Mamdani in November. I think that it was a terrible mistake to lead with attacks against Mamdani that had to do with socialism and anti-Semitism. Turns out that there are plenty of people in this city who like or sort of don't see as very problematic either of those.
They're selling points. I mean, yeah.
And so the more that people said, you can't vote for him, he's a socialist, the more they thought, oh, you're speaking my language. And the same might be true of the anti-Semitic charge. Some people just didn't believe he was an anti-Semite. They separate that from his anti-Israel stance. Okay, that's what they, that's how they parse that out for themselves. Some people, really felt that he is anti-Semitic, and nobody cares. And so the Jewish community, I guess, has to do exactly what you said and defend themselves and stop waiting for the Zohran Mandamis and others to rally around them and then become distressed when they don't. It's also worth noting, we don't have the numbers on this either, but at some point, Mamdani had something like 20% of the Jewish vote in New York. Yeah. So Jewish means different things to different people, and there are different priorities embedded in that word. But the important point is not even all that. It's going forward. If there's going to be an attempt to defeat him in November, whether people think Eric Adams can pull it off or there's some candidate that Bill Ackman is going to fund who will get into the race that we can all get behind, the way to defeat Zohran Mandami is not the way that they campaigned against him in the primary. And I don't want to see a bunch of people standing on street corners, middle-aged women on the Upper East Side handing out flyers, talking about socialism and anti-Semitism. It's not a good strategy. We have to become strategic, not emotional, about the way we fight these fights. And the Jewish communal organizations in particular own a piece of this failure. There are organizations that were literally set up to defeat democratic socialists in these races, and they failed spectacularly. And so there has to be a reckoning also for Jewish organizations that produce a population of Jews in New York City, 20% of whom, or maybe more, would vote for someone like this, not just because he has anti-Israel leanings, anti-Semitic tendencies, but also because he's so anti-American.
Yeah, and I totally. I mean, as you said, the Israel stuff is not even we know where he stands. I mean, there was that press release on October 8th. I mean, there's no question about it. That is what it is. For me, a lot of the concern about Mamdani is not even so much about that. It's just about basic, as you said, safety, services, running the city, subway, things like that.
Right, just basic managerial skills, the ability to do the job, which is no longer a prerequisite in the United States for doing a job under democratic sort of rule. But, this is a complex city, a huge budget. We need somebody who actually knows how to run things. And all that gets lost when a guy with a nice smile dances on a float with AOC. It's just tragic that style over substance wins.
Right. So what's the game plan? I mean, so we have we have Curtis Sliwa. He said this morning, the only way I'm getting this out of this race is if I'm 6 feet under in a pine box. Then we have Cuomo has not said he won't run. It looks like he's sticking around. We have Eric Adams relaunching his campaign. I mean, this looks like if you were to design a scenario where Mamdani wins, this is it. Right. All these candidates, jockeying, and they're all going to see in the data, what they want to see. Cuomo will say, I run better in a general election than in a Democratic primary. Obviously, for sure. But the question is, if he and Adams are running, you say, well, okay, well, everyone needs to just get behind Adams. Adams isn't exactly, FDR either at the peak of his powers. So there are no real great options here, Rebecca.
There aren't great options. John McLaughlin was not optimistic that anybody but Zohran Mandani would end up as our mayor. The optimistic message is that if Governor Hochul is vulnerable, a new governor could interrupt many of his plans for New York because he doesn't act unilaterally. A lot of the things that he says he wants to do, he cannot do alone. He needs statewide support for. So there's some silver lining there. A lot of things he said he's going to do, he simply won't be able to do. They're unrealistic and fake promises. But, I'm worried most about what he's going to do to our police department. I hope he keeps Jessica Tisch in as our commissioner. I'm not sure that he will. But even if he does, will he disempower her to the point where it won't matter much?
Yeah, and it's worth saying that Alvin Bragg also won his nomination, right? And Adams, whatever you think, at least sort of was willing to push back occasionally against Bragg, and obviously Mamdani is not going to be doing that.
I guess where I'm left feeling is that at this point, either we have a very clear alternative, a real data set that supports the potential for that person to win, and the finances to make that happen, and a turnout campaign that would, a ground game that would produce those results, or we save our time and money and put it into the governor's race and at least put up some roadblocks.
Right. That's very smart. I think it is worth zooming out and just saying, this is really a remarkable development. I mean, we've never had someone of this politics, a socialist, win this big an election in America. And it's a real watershed in terms of populism. And, I think people love a winner. And I wonder what the copycat effect is going to be here. This is a real sign of strength from the Bernie Sanders AOC wing of the Democratic Party. And now they have a belt, a scalp they can point to. And that makes a really big difference, I think.
Could it be that, or could it is that, but could it also at the same time be the death knell of the Democratic Party's tolerance for this part of their party, which has, they've tolerated it for so long and pretended that it wasn't growing and it wasn't important. Now that it plays out and it might ruin Manhattan, New York City, one of the greatest cities in the world, it might be the beginning of the end. But, we're going to have to live through 4 years of it to get to the other side is the bad news for all of us who are here. Yeah. Are you going to stay in New York?
Until they kick me out. I mean, listen, I think one issue is, Democrats are going to say, we failed to win men, we failed to win minority men in the presidential election, and they're going to say, hey, this guy Zohran, he's cracked a kind of code here. And so whatever movement in that direction of the party, I think, is going to be accelerated.
Yeah, but the problem is the code, it's not really that complicated because President Trump showed them what the code is. The code is economic populism. The code is people can't afford to live here and they can't afford to buy food. And so the answer to that for the Democrats for a very long time was align yourself with the very rich and placate the poor and don't worry about the people in the middle. And they abandoned that whole middle group. And of course, they swung towards President Trump. And so the answer is not then to swing all the way to the other extreme and go socialist. Why don't the Democrats just re-embrace the working class and the middle class the way they used to decades ago? It seems like the simplest way to stay in power and to do what's best for the country. But if the staying in power is certainly their goal, they're just maybe bad at it. But maybe doing what's best for the country isn't on their agenda because they keep doing this.
Yeah, I mean, one of our columnists, Michael Barone, has called Zohran's base, the barista proletariat, right? So kind of like, and I think that captures something, but it doesn't capture everything. I mean, there are real, that focus on affordability, that focus on cost of living, that laser-like focus with a little bit of like pro-Palestinian like sexiness thrown in proved to be a winning formula, and he was able to win the sort of, the encampment crew, but also, the South Indian immigrants, and who I think don't really care about this stuff, but, were really, got like the idea of sort of some of the more economic things. So, every election is, there's you create the electorate, you want, and he really cracked a certain code here. And as you said, it's is it a harbinger or is it a warning? Maybe a little bit of both. Okay, Rebecca, let's move on. Let's do our sunburn. Why don't I go? I'll go just because actually mine is related to this, and that is, the weakness, the weak spines, the malleable spines, squishy spines of of New York Democrats, who are unwilling, who are now falling in line behind Mamdani. I think any real test of strength, of character, is where are the lines you draw for your own side, right? Anyone can say we hate Trump. Anyone can say we hate the Republicans, but is there a willingness to police their own side? And I'm looking here at Chuck Schumer, who released a nothing statement. And he eventually will endorse him. It's like so clear. He's worried about his own primary, and 3 letters, AOC, I think. And then, but not only that, I mean, Jerry Nadler, who we've had to hear for years on the Upper West Side talk about his love for Israel and Zionism. I mean, I don't expect anything different, but, the Brad Lander, kind of buddy romance thing was just ridiculous. And it's just, it's a capitulation. I really give credit to the Democrats, and there have been some who've come out and said, no, we don't support this. We'll do everything we can, mostly from swing districts or districts that lean more to the right.
Kristen Gillibrand was one, right?
Yeah, Gillibrand. Swazi has been, I think, a little bit skeptical. This other woman, I forget, had released a great statement that was just like, no way, Jose. This is totally beyond the pale. It's maybe not surprising, but especially New York's Jewish Democrats, right? Like who pitch themselves as like heir to the Jewishness of New York City, right? That Jews helped build New York in a lot of ways, not the only ones, but in significant share. And that the collapse of that sort of New York Jewish politics, or the failure of it, right, I think is a real story, and the capitulation and collaboration in their own failure is, I think, what we're seeing from that generation of politicians.
Right. Shocking alert. Jerry Nadler and Chuck Schumer are empty suit politicians who will say and do anything to stay in power.
Yeah.
Okay. Mine has to do with the bill that the House just passed this past week, saying that illegal immigrants who are caught driving while intoxicated must be deported. Now, that's not my sunburn. I like the idea of people who drive drunk, who shouldn't be here in the first place, being deported. What I find sort of surprising and tragic is that we've accepted as a country that being here illegally is not illegal. You have to commit a second illegal act in order to warrant deportation. So illegal doesn't mean anything anymore. The language and law in America has been so redefined and denuded in so many ways that they don't mean anything. And I think that even as President Trump is doing, I think, a really good job of attacking the illegal immigration problem, and his poll numbers are solid on that front. And most Americans believe that illegal immigrants should be deported, and they certainly believe that illegal criminal immigrants should be deported, having to add that word criminal suggests that we've lost the larger narrative and that people who are here illegally are somehow viewed as not that illegal.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. And we'll talk next week. What a busy week it's been. Wow. And I'm sure next one will be as well. Have a great weekend. We'll see you soon.
Good to have you back, Ari.
Good to be here.